of Dr. Beverly Beeton's good friends. Welcome to the session today on suffrage and women's history in Alaska. And Pollnow and Sherif are going to be the presenters today. I'm Anjuli Grantham. I'm going to be the moderator of this session. I'm curator of statewide services at the Alaska State Museum in Juneau, and I co-curated the Alaska Suffrage Star exhibit with the assistance of our dear Dr. Beverly Beeton. A couple of housekeeping notes. Please do mute yourself unless you're presenting. Please also hold your questions and discussion items until after both presenters have finished their presentations. And at that time, please feel free to use the raise hand feature that you'll find if you click on the participants button. There'll be a little raise hand feature. Click on that and we'll call on you. You can also use the Q&A box. And if you're having technical problems, please use the chat feature and you'll correspond directly with Karen, who will connect with you and help you with whatever, resolve your tech issues. So the photo that you see here is from about a year ago when a merry bunch of mischief makers gathered in Kodiak, having somewhat belatedly decided that we better get our act together if we were going to make anything of the upcoming centennial of the 19th Amendment. And at the Kodiak conference, we hosted a working lunch meant to inspire suffrage-related activities during 2020. Dr. Beverly Beeton, historian of Progressive Era Alaska, stole the show at the working lunch, of course. And over the next year, she offered resources, encouragement, and more to assure that women's history would not be ignored in Alaska as we approach the centennial of the 19th Amendment. So piece by piece and program by program, without any central organization and certainly without any centralized funding, we managed to share the history of suffrage and women over the course of the year. Many plans were stymied when Women's History Month in March coincided with a new episode in American history, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. Considering that Beverly had spent considerable time documenting the history of the Spanish flu in Alaska, she became quite busy with speaking engagements on this topic. However, Beverly also bemoaned that women again were going to get short shrift because of this pandemic. Nonetheless, we persisted. And over the last year, Alaska's cultural organizations and advocacy groups have hosted exhibits on women's suffrage and women's history, hosted webinars and courses on women's history, developed posters and social media campaigns, shared resources, and we've come together to commemorate the women who labored for generations to achieve the vote, all while recognizing that suffrage mostly benefited white women. Beverly's spring and summer speaking tour was canceled because of the pandemic, but thankfully she was able to lecture on women's suffrage at the Anchorage Museum prior to everything getting shut down. And in the spring and summer, she shared the biographies of some impressive Alaska suffragists through webinar presentations. She was in the process of pivoting her planned keynote presentation for this very conference to a virtual format when she unexpectedly died on August 27th. The day after Women's Equality Day. Bev Beeton's work epitomized the compelling and the exciting aspects of history. Her examination of the Spanish flu, World War I, and more in early territorial Alaska can be considered essential to our understanding of those topics. And her research into the history of women's suffrage and women in early territorial Alaska is in fact seminal. I'm honored to dedicate this session in the memory of Dr. Beverly Beeton, our friend, our colleague, and our fellow mischief maker. Here's to you, Bev. We love you and we miss you. So now I'm going to turn it over to Sherif. Sue retired from the Alaska State Library in 2014. Her talk is based on a course on women's suffrage that she taught for the Fairbanks Osher Lifelong Institute in February of 2020. She has served as a board member and president of the League of Women Voters of the Tanana Valley, and she's on the board of the League of Women Voters of Alaska. And I want to thank the League of Women Voters for all that they've done over the last year to support suffrage-related activities in education and all that they do to encourage transparent and fair elections. Turn it over to you, Sue. I'm going to stop sharing. Oh, looks like I'm already stopped sharing. To you.
Thank you, Anjuli. It's really an honor to be here. I am both honored and I feel just a bit of a imposter because I do not have the, it says I'm screen sharing. Is this true? Okay, but my presentation
It is true.
is not opening. Here it is. Okay. And all the gazillion Zoom sessions I've attended, I still haven't mastered screen sharing. I apologize. I also apologize because I have nowhere near the qualifications as a professional historian that Bev did, nor do I have her verve and flair. So I start with some intimidation, but I'm really glad that we're able to remember her today. And
Sue, we still don't see your PowerPoint.
Oh, you don't? It says I'm sharing.
Yeah, but you have to open the PowerPoint. We just have your computer screen.
It's open and it says I'm sharing, but it's not sharing my screen, darn it. Okay, that's, as I said, I still haven't mastered this. I'm going to stop sharing and try it again.
Yeah, and it's, make sure you pick the window, the box that has the PowerPoint already open instead of your desktop or something else.
Yeah. Okay, I have selected it again. Are you seeing something now?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Perfect.
Okay, we're in sync. Very good. So as we all know, August marked the centennial commemoration of the 19th Amendment, both the ratification and its certification on August 26, 1920. And it meant that women who were US citizens had the right to vote in all states of the Union, at least on paper. The 19th Amendment was neither the beginning nor the end of the struggle, America's struggle to determine who may vote. Instead, it's been a long, challenging, and continuing battle to recognize that one of the key privileges of citizenship is the right to vote. Our Constitution itself originally had nothing to say about who is a qualified voter and what exactly citizenship means. Instead, it was left to the individual states to determine voter qualifications.
There's just some other noise going on.
A few of the original states allowed voting by women and free Black men in certain circumstances. But for the most part, early American voters were white men who owned property, or in some states who paid taxes. Even the qualifications for the minority of the population who might qualify to vote varied from state to state. In 1806, New Jersey abolished its provision for women to vote, and after that, no women anywhere in the country could legally vote until the 19th, not until the 19th Amendment, but for the first half of the new century. In early elections, less than 10% of the population constituted the country's new male electorate. In the early 1800s, as Americans discussed and refined their ideas of voting and who was a voter and what citizenship was, and as they tried to address under what circumstances the new waves of German and then Irish immigrants, whether they might or might not qualify to be citizens, women began to look for their rights as citizens as well. Women at that time had very few legal rights. As you can see, property rights, no. Right to enter a contract independently, no. If you were a married woman, you couldn't own a business without your husband's permission. If you left a marriage, and divorce was difficult, but if you left an unfortunate marriage, you had no right to the custody of your children. If you could find employment, you had no right to your own wages. Higher education and professional education opportunities were extremely limited. You couldn't vote or serve on a jury, and women were not even allowed to speak publicly at what were called promiscuous audiences. And by promiscuous audiences, they meant audiences that contained both men and women. As doors to education began to open for a few women, they began to look for ways to improve the lot of all women. Many of these women became activists in the movement to abolish slavery. And as they joined abolition groups, they began to see that they were limited in their advocacy because they had no standing as voters. Or even within the abolition movement, they took a back seat, literally a back seat. Here's the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840. And when the American delegation, the US delegation arrived, Lucretia Mott was an official delegate, and she was shown a place in the very back of the room where she was seated, and she was told that she was not allowed to speak. And she joined the other women back there in the dim area behind the barrier, and where also young Elizabeth Cady Stanton sat. Well, after that experience, in 1848, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and 3 other abolitionists in upstate New York organized a gathering to discuss women's rights, and Stanton's Declaration of Sentiments, which was patterned heavily on Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, but it read, "All men and women are created equal." The Seneca Falls Convention attracted women and men to discuss the women's rights and to act on resolutions for action. There were 12 resolutions, 11 of which passed with enthusiastic unanimity, but one resolution that Elizabeth Cady Stanton had added, despite Lucretia Mott's and her own husband's objections, called for the right of women to vote. And this resolution became the most hotly debated topic of all. It passed only when Frederick Douglass, the only African-American delegate, spoke up in favor of it. After that debate, the idea of women's suffrage flowered, although it was to take 70 years before the warriors of the movement were able to translate their advocacy into the 19th Amendment. And of the women assembled that day, only one lived to 1920. And at that point, she was 91, 92 years old. And she was not able to go to the polls in 1920. And in 1921, she had lost her eyesight. So she was the sole survivor of that original group. Susan B. Anthony was not at Seneca Falls, but she soon joined Stanton in devoting her life to the cause. And we still know Anthony and Stanton's names today, but along with Anthony and Stanton were others who should be remembered. You already know the names of Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, these women who were born enslaved, who spoke up and acted against slavery and enslavement. But did you know that both of these towering figures were outspoken as women's suffragists? National and local organizations for women's suffrage bloomed, merged, faded, and reemerged during the course of the next 70 years. From these groups came women like Lucy Stone, a stirring orator, early graduate of Oberlin College in Ohio, and devoted abolitionist, and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, an African-American poet, orator, and abolitionist. After the Civil War, the women's suffrage movement floundered when the nation debated the 14th and 15th Amendments. These amendments established free Black men as citizens and voters. The suffragists, who had worked hand in glove as part of the abolition movement, thought the end of the Civil War would bring equal rights for all, including the right to vote. Instead, they were told it was, quote, the Negroes' hour, and that women of all races would have to wait. Much to their horror, the 14th Amendment, and I know it's probably difficult to read, but the salient point are the three red words that all say male, and this represents the first introduction of the word male into the Constitution or its amendment. They were horrified, and because these had never appeared in the Constitution before, in spite of the fact that the leaders Stanton and Anthony, who felt betrayed by the compromise, uttered racist comments in their bitterness and actively opposed the 15th Amendment, women of all races continued the struggle despite the resulting division of suffragist ranks. Supporting the 15th Amendment, Lucy Burns and her husband, Henry Blackwell, Frederick Douglass, and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and others formed the American Women's Suffrage Association, which worked for women's suffrage through changes to state laws because that's where the laws on voting resided. Against the amendment, and determined that a federal constitutional amendment, the next one they hoped, would bring women's suffrage, Stanton, Anthony, and their ardent followers formed the women-only National Women Suffrage Association. The two groups worked in parallel but separately until 1890, when they merged to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, quite a mouthful, referred to as NAWSA. And that group carried on through the passage of the 19th Amendment. But meanwhile, back in 1869, way out west, Wyoming Territory became the first to have a Women's Suffrage Act. Then other new Western territories and states began to pass women's suffrage acts, either as acts of their legislature, like Wyoming did, or through popular referenda. Dr. Beverly Beeton chronicled the first 4 Western territories and states, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho, in her book, based on her doctoral dissertation, called Women Vote in the West, the Women's Suffrage Movement 1869 to 1896. This map, the map proves it, shows the further progression after 1900, heavily centered in the West. A cartographer has suggested that this map was one of the most commonly reproduced maps in the early 20th century because the suffragists put it on billboards, newspaper ads, magazine ads, napkins, anything that they could print it on to chart the progress of their cause. And the white states are the ones that by 1915 had achieved women's suffrage. And you see down in Mexico, or the Gulf of Mexico, or not the Gulf of Mexico, the Baja California perhaps, they have placed Alaska for 1913. The dark states, primarily clustered in the South, are states where there was no women's suffrage, and the crosshatched or gray-looking states are ones that where there was partial suffrage. Either women could vote in local elections, not in the federal election, or they could vote for president, but not in state elections. It was it varied again state by state. Even so, the opposition to female voters continued to argue that women were not biologically suited to voting, not intellectually capable. Women voting would subvert the family structure. Who would cook dinner on election day? And that a wife's vote would only, 1, duplicate her husband's vote, and that's not fair, or 2, cancel out her husband's vote, and that's not fair either. When the considerable forces of Frances Willard and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, with chapters all over America, embraced the cause of votes for women, the liquor industry actively campaigned against women's suffrage. As we saw on the map earlier, in 1913, One of the first acts of Alaska's territorial legislature was a woman's suffrage act. Dr. Beeton, in Alaska Historical Society resource guide that she made with Bruce Parham, wrote, some of the reasons women's suffrage in Alaska became law quickly are, and I quote her, when it enabled a legislature in Alaska, the US Congress authorized Alaska's legislators to enfranchise women, and they didn't mandate it, but they opened the door for it, and it was up to the legislature, and they took it up right away. The National American Women's Suffrage Association and the Washington State suffragists lobbied Alaska's representatives and senators as soon as they were elected for the new territorial legislature. For some, like Cornelia Hatcher, who was a temperance woman herself, she had given speeches around Alaska favoring votes for women. Socialists, the Western Federation of Miners, and other labor unions had declared in favor of voting rights for women. In short, support for women's involvement in politics had grown, and those are the words of Bev Beeton. As the early leaders like Stanton and Anthony passed on, new leaders like Carrie Chapman Catt, Alice Paul, and Lucy Burns took their place. Once again, the path diverged when Paul and Burns brought a more confrontational style of political action that they learned from their experiences in England, where they had joined English suffragettes, as they were called, suffragettes in England, suffragists in the United States. The suffragettes were led by the formidable Pankhursts. When Woodrow Wilson became president, Paul and Burns staged a massive 1913 march in Washington that ended up with male onlookers totally out of control and attacking the marchers at the end. Paul and Burns also moved their advocacy to another level in 1917 when they staged the first acts of organized civil disobedience in front of the White House in US history, as they stood as silent sentinels 6 days a week for months, resulting in jailing, forced feedings. Their actions, considered outrageous by some at the time, actually brought public sympathy and pushed the needle closer to Congress and President Wilson's eventual acceptance of the need for a constitutional amendment. The intensely organized congressional lobbying of Carrie Chapman Catt and the more public action of Paul and Burns combined to produce results. Oops, here we go. Okay, in 1920, you can see the results. Alice Paul is celebrating the passage of the 20th Amendment by unfurling a flag on which she sewed a new star with each state that ratified the amendment. Victory was theirs. Most people, if pressed, could come up with Susan B. Anthony as a name, as a person to credit for women's right to vote. And indeed, the 19th Amendment was called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. But we all need to know the names of suffragists of that time, like Ida B. Wells, who was a journalist and anti-lynching activist, an amazing woman who was told to march at the back of the parade in Washington in 1913, and she was no back of the bus, back of the parade woman, and slipped herself into her Illinois delegation and marched with the rest of them. Mary Church Terrell, she also was one of the original founders of the NAACP. Mary Church Terrell was an educator, graduate of Oberlin College, which seemed to have spawned many of the early suffragists. And she went on to found the National Association of Colored Women, which became quite a powerful group and was heavily involved with suffrage activities as well. Also, we need to know more about Dr. Mabel Pinghua Lee, who was at the age of 18, led a New York suffrage parade and got her mother involved in suffrage activities. And she was the first Chinese American woman to graduate with a PhD in the United States. She got a PhD from Columbia in economics. And then Sitka Shah, who was a Yankton, Dakota woman who was both an artist and a musician, a writer, and an activist for Native American rights. Many African American suffrage leaders like Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell continued in the movement despite leaders' statements like Stanton's that educated white women were more qualified as voters than uneducated free Black men. And she had a lot more to say that was much more crude and overtly racist, but I'm not repeating them here. Even more, we need to know about the many local women's groups, the grassroots of the suffrage movement, as my co-panelist Anne Pollnow has done and will tell us about this, the Sitka's Women's Club. Hard won though the passage of the 19th Amendment was, the struggle was not over. For example, in the Alaska Territory, after the Suffrage Act was passed in 1913, most Alaska Natives, male or female, were still not able to vote because they weren't recognized as US citizens. And their citizenship wasn't established till 1924. Some Alaska Natives in Southeast Alaska actually did vote by renouncing their culture and their traditional ways and having a certain number of witnesses and a lot of falderal. And so there were some Alaska Native voters, but most Alaska Natives were not able to vote. And so their citizenship was recognized in 1924. And then in 1925, the Territorial legislature enacted legislation aimed at Alaska Natives that established an English language literacy test as a qualification for voting. And Professor Stephen Haycox has documented this well in his article on William Paul and the Literacy Act of 1925. And that act stayed on the books until after 1965. Here's a representation of the longer struggles for women's suffrage and suffrage by a young graphic artist from Fairbanks, Brianna Turnbull, who now lives in Spokane, Washington. And she gave me permission to use this image. And I think I have to point out that these women are not wearing COVID masks. The dates represent landmark dates for voting rights for each of these groups. And I think we all, this summer especially, but this whole year, have been thinking about African-American men who had gained the right to vote through the post-Civil War 14th and 15th Amendments, and the women, African-American women who gained the right in 1920, but if they lived in the South, they were barred from voting by Jim Crow measures and physical violence that wouldn't end until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s led to the enactment of the Voters' Right Act of 1965, and some would say has continued. Even today, we read of attempts at voter suppression, so the struggle of previous generations for the right to vote continues to this day. What are some of the results of women's achievement to the vote, or the direct results, perhaps, of the 19th Amendment? Well, first of all, 8 to 9 million women voted in the 1920 presidential election. Of the over 20 million then eligible, they all didn't rush to the polls, but that was the largest increase in the electorate in the history of our country. And now today, women actually outnumber men, and I think have for the past decade, as voters. In Alaska in 1940, Mary Gibson of Ketchikan ran as an independent for Alaska House. So the year after the Territorial Act in 1913, we have the first woman running for office. And then in 1916, Lena Mora Lewis was a socialist candidate for the congressional position of congressional delegate to Washington, D.C. And she got 10% of the vote, but James Wickersham was the clear winner there. In 1937, Nell Scott of Seldovia was elected to the Territorial legislature, and she was the first elected woman officer. By statehood, 16 women representing 27 terms had served in the territorial legislatures. And after statehood, we've had 90 women serve in our state legislature. Alaska now ranks 10th in percentage of state legislative seats held by women, 36.7%. And we, as we all know, have elected a woman as governor, lieutenant governor, and US senator. And just to see how we stack up, here's Nevada, which in 2018 actually achieved a female majority state legislature. And I'm not sure that you can read the little dots, but here is Alaska, right, hugging the 40% stacked up with other states that have similar percentages. And over here, we have the percentage of women that made up the US Congress after the 2014 elections. And that's at 24%. And down at the bottom are Mississippi and West Virginia with just a little over 10%. And I have to, because I feel strongly we need to learn more about the women and the men who fought for women's voting rights and all voting rights. I want to commend to you, Anjuli, Grantham, and Bev Beeton's work on the Alaska Suffrage Star, the Alaska State Museum online and traveling exhibit. And if you haven't looked at it, you need to do that. Pictured here is Tilly Paul, William Paul's mother, Tilly Paul Tamery, and William Paul's mother, and both of them were involved in suffrage, heavily involved in suffrage activities. Also, I'd like to recommend the National Park Service's website as an online resource. Their Women's History and 19th Amendment pages are very strong, and they do highlight a wide variety of early suffragists. And they even have a mapping project that is connected with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Closer to home, we have from the Rasmussen Library and Karen Brewster, our own Karen Brewster, we have from Project Jukebox, Recovering Our Past, which is a joint effort by, it's a partnership with California State University at Long Beach, and the historian Sherna B. Gluck, who interviewed women who in 1970s were in their 80s and 90s, and took oral histories of their experience as actual suffragettes, or suffragists, pardon me. And finally, I want to again tip my hat to Beverly Beeton. The book that I mentioned earlier, which unfortunately there are only 2 copies in the state now. It's out of print, but Women Vote in the West. And a shorter version, a condensed version of it, is available in a book that still is in print, One Woman, One Vote, Rediscovering the Women's Suffrage Movement. And then the resource guide that I mentioned that's available to you on the Alaska Historical Society website that she and Bruce Parham prepared as of July of this year. And then Bruce Parham on the Cook Inlet Historical Society site has a memorial for Bev as well, and you can find all those except the books online, both of those except the books online. And that's it. So Anjuli, back to you.
Thank you very much, Sue. We're going to move on now to Elise Pollnow. Anne is an archaeologist based in Sitka, and she's working to document the history of the Sitka Women's Club and the historic building that the Sitka Women's Club has owned for many years. So please take it away, Anne.
Oh, thank you. You can hear me. So let me get my PowerPoint up. Oops, that's not it. Okay. Here we go. Oh. How's that?
That's work if you just want to make it a full screen slideshow.
There we are.
Yep, perfect.
Yeah, good. Okay. Thank you. Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks Anjuli and Sue. Yes, I'm Pollnow. I'm here in Sitka. I am a member of the Sitka Women's Club, but before I get into my presentation, I'd like to get our meeting started as appropriate. So I've called on the president of the Sitka Women's Club, Robin McNeely, to help me do that.
Well, hello and welcome to our Sitka Women's Club meeting. I'd like to call us to order. It's October 9th, 2020, and I'll begin with our welcome and roll call. My name is Robin McNeely. I've been a member of the Sitka Women's Club since 2012. I've been president of the Sitka Women's Club since 2016, but my association with the Sitka Women's Club goes back to 2002, when as a young mom, I requested and received a $1,000 scholarship to advance my college education. I now have a master's degree in communication sciences and disorders, and I work here in Sitka. So we meet the first Saturday of every month for the months of September through May, and we allow ourselves a 3-month hiatus for June, July, and August because nobody can do things in the summer on a regular schedule. Our new members are always welcome, and members are encouraged to bring friends and daughters. Our dues are $10 per year and can be waived if requested. We like to begin our meeting with a reading of the Sitka Women's Club Creed. And that goes like this. Keep us, O God, from pettiness. Let us be large in thought, in word, and in deed. Let us be done with fault-finding and leave off self-seeking. May we put away all pretense and meet each other face to face without self-pity and without prejudice. May we never be hasty in judgment and always generous. Teach us to put into action our better impulses, straightforward and unafraid. Let us take time for all things. Make us grow calm, serene, gentle. Grant that we may realize it is the little things that create differences, and in the big things of life, we are as one. And may we strive to touch and know the great woman's heart of us all. And O Lord God, let us not forget to be kind. Thank you for attending. I'm going to give it back to our amazing treasurer, Anne Pollnow. She has brought a level of enthusiasm and professionalism that has boosted our morale and our knowledge of our roots in Sitka history. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robin. I also bring the beverages. So the Sitka Women's Club, we're here celebrating 100-year plus of years of incorporation. Social clubs, fraternities, and sororities have been a big part of the American culture, and of course the early days of Sitka followed that pattern. With the exception of a couple national women's groups like the Daughters of the American Revolution and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the women's clubs in Sitka started of a local nature and then later affiliated with state or national groups. Pictured here, I have a clipping from a 1986 newspaper, and it is Jesse Price is in the center, and she is celebrating her membership from 1924. Before Sitka, Sitka and Alaska became a territory, there's no record of women's clubs in the Russian era. And much of my research is from Robert DeArmond and newspaper articles. So what got me into thinking that the Sitka Women's Club was associated with the suffrage movement was their initial affiliation with the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The first women's organization in Sitka was formed in the summer of 1888. Miss Jessie Ackerman, a national lecturer for the Women's Christian Temperance Union, visited Sitka in June of that year. At the court, she delivered what was described as her famous discourse titled San Francisco by Gaslight, or the Vices of a Great City. Jessie Ackerman was often called the most traveled woman in the world by her contemporaries. She circled the globe as the Women's Christian Temperance Union's second round the world missionary from 1888 to 1896, spreading her message for the temperance reform and women's suffrage, among other issues. She challenged the norms of her time by becoming an ordained Baptist minister in 1897 with her own congregation in Georgia. Traveling to Sitka, she didn't leave until a Sitka chapter was formed. It was Mrs. P.A. Swineford. Oops, let me get on my. That was the first founding member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, with two other officers from the Presbyterian mission. The group met regularly Friday evenings at the new schoolhouse, and that was just built on Lincoln Street. Some years later, the group rented a log building that was once called the Collar and Elbow Saloon at the corner of Lincoln and Maxudoff Streets. And they opened a free reading room. Ironically, meeting in a saloon, it is probable, however, that this local chapter of the union had some influence in getting the U.S. District Judge to hold an election in 1913 that resulted in the closing of Sitka's 3 saloons on May 1st, 1914. Sitka did go dry. The chapter there's evidence or newspaper articles that the union was still formed in 1923. Robert DeArmond wrote in his yesteryear columns in the Sitka Sentinel. It was reported in the Alaska in December 1899 that the Women's Club of Sitka held its December meeting at the governor's house. So this is the first known article or information that we have that there was a Sitka Women's Reading Club formed. They had decided on the Merchant of Venice for their study, and the opening acts of the play were read and discussed. DeArmond writes that the Women's Club was active by 1901 and met regularly on Thursday afternoons at the Marine Barracks, which is now the Sitka Pioneers' home, as there was no public library at the time. He inferred that perhaps the women were reading to the Marines, or maybe they had a library of their own. It's also mentioned again in February of 1902. It was the inaugurated that the Women's Club of Sitka inaugurated the year by holding a reception at the governor's house, where Miss Elizabeth Patton Brady was assisted by W.R. Mills, the vice president of the club. Before the Women's Club of Sitka was formed. There is a slight note about the Daughters of the American Revolution. The national chapter was established, the national organization established a chapter in Sitka in 1902. This Mrs. Joseph Pendleton, the wife of the commandant of the local Marine Corps contingent, may have been one of the organizers. We don't know much about the Daughters of the American Revolution in Sitka. DeArmond writes that his mother was sent an invitation, but before she had answered, the group was no longer. So on the scene next was the Alaskan reports that the Sitka Women's Club recently organized with 14 charter members. Mrs. George Stowell is the president. The club is organized under 5 departments: art and literature, music and drama, philanthropy and sociology, parliamentary law, and home economics. And Mrs. W.R. Mills is the vice president. Months later, the Alaskan reported the Women's Club of Sitka had a very interesting meeting Thursday at the governor's house with Mrs. Brady as hostess. A selection of Longfellow was read by Mrs. Buchanan. A talk on the symbols of art was given, Egyptian art was given by Miss Patton, and an interesting paper on, symbols of art was given by Miss Patton, and an interesting paper on Egyptian art was read by Mrs. Elinjeski. Mrs. Flower read a distinctive description of the Sphinx, and Mrs. Stowell gave some awakening comments on the Great Pyramids. So they were very worldly and kept in tune with what was going on. This photo, let me go back to this other photo that's noted. So in 1888, we know very, very little. There's very little information on the Dorcas Society. But this photo was found in the Sitka Historical Museum, and it does say Dorcas Society, but it doesn't seem to coincide with the dates that they may have existed in Sitka. So what happened to the Sitka Club, the Women's Club of Sitka? We're not quite sure because there weren't any newspapers at that time between 1907 and 1920. So it's likely that the Women's Club of Sitka morphed into the Friendly Society. The Friendly Society, although has been known to have met as early as 1913. It was organized May 16, 1916 in connection with the community church, with 12 charter members, quickly increasing to 27 members. The purpose of the society was to strengthen the social life of Sitka to the interest of the members in all branches of Christian work, in home, church, and community, to study mission, civic, and social problems, and render aid in worthy causes. They were very much involved with what was happening during World War II, and very much wanted to participate and support the war efforts. They joined a chapter of the Red Cross and gathered to perform. They gathered in having sewing events and supporting the troops, and also the locally women and children. The Friendly Club is originally where the philanthropy of the Sitka Women's Club began. Prior to this, it was more of a social arrangement with discussions on world affairs, but the Friendly Club took a lot of action to support women and children through philanthropy. The first officers of the Friendly Club were Elizabeth Davidson DeArmond, so Robert DeArmond's mother. The president was Alice Buchanan. The vice president was Lillian Johns. The Sitka Tribune began to publish again in May of 1922 and was succeeded by the Progress, which continued in business in 1927. The Friendly Club was mentioned in those papers, but in July, it was selling candies at the 4th of July events and holding sewing bees. But it's quickly moved on to be considered the Friendly Club. The Friendly Club was very active in raising funds for the Sitka Public Library, which started in the spring of 1923, in keeping with their tradition of having reading groups and supporting literature and the arts. They also at this time developed a scholarship program to benefit single mothers attempting to get into the labor market and continuing education, which, as Robin just mentioned, she was one of the recipients of this scholarship. So we keep that going today. The Sitka Women's Club evolved from the Friendly Club in 1935, finding the program definitely patterned after the Federated Club. The Constitution presented, the Constitution of the Friendly Club was presented to the American Federation of Women's Club, and the club accepted their membership. Similar to their original mission, the focus of the Sitka Women's Club was to be of service to the community, to champion humanitarian causes wherever they might be, as well as identify problems and devise solutions. In April of 1939, a resolution amended the club's name to be known as the Sitka Women's Club. The name of the club was officially changed from the Friendly Club to the Sitka Women's Club. And it was noted in July of 1939 in the local paper that it marked a red letter day for the Sitka Women's Club, who hosted members of the business and professional women who were making the Southeast Alaska tour after the close of the convention in Seattle. The whole town entered into the pleasure of entertaining the guests after the gangplank had been lowered. Two honored hostesses and members of the Sitka Women's Club who were constantly surrounded by the eager guests were Mrs. Anna Hanlon and Mrs. Nadia Bart. Both ladies were little girls and were present on Castle Hill when the flag of the last Russians was lowered for the last time, and the Stars and Stripes raised to fly from the top of the staff. Their vivid account of the event brought out notebooks and pencils from the visitors' handbags. They were kept busy all afternoon. The Sitka Women's Club kept the ball rolling with the library and reading and began collecting funds for a city library building. And they were still closely associated with the American Red Cross. They were very active in the community for political affairs. Noted in the meeting minutes of November 10th in this graphic is one of the townspeople came to them and noting the need for a nurse, and the Sitka Women's Club decided they would take on that endeavor and provide the town with the funds to support a nurse. They were also very active in ensuring the town was clean, and they made sure that they sent out letters to neighbors and the townspeople about keeping the streets clean and their little litter taken care of. And from the early years, they, besides the scholarship fund, they also provided a loan fund for graduates of Sitka High to further their education. There's a great tradition of giving in Sitka for many, many years, from St. Michael's Cathedral to the Salvation Army. The Sitka Women's Club still donates funds for the holiday dinners to the Salvation Army and the Alaska Native Brotherhood. And we continue to gather and celebrate each other's birthdays. How do we make this money to support the community in such a way is through this little clubhouse that we have, and our membership dues. However, the membership dues haven't increased since the 1950s, when they were $10. We want to keep it affordable, and as long as we have the clubhouse rented and we're making revenues from that and through donations, we can continue to support the community through scholarships and grants. Our clubhouse was originally built in 1897 by Hans Christian Pond. He was an attorney who arrived in Sitka in 1895 with his daughter Ragnhild. Ragnhild opened a millinery business while her father went out prospecting. Ragnhild lived on one side of the house and had a shop on the other. At the time, the house was known as the Cottage by the Sea. And it was the home was on a rocky point there next to the current library, and it's still there. The house was given to Ragnhild after she married Meyer Hofstede. In 1903, Ragnhild sold the house and lot to Dr. James Cogwell for $450. And by 1904, she was divorced from Hofstede and moved down to Tacoma with her son. In 1910, Dr. Cogswell, a dentist who was the father of Mrs. W.P. Williams, sold the house to W.P. Williams Corporation. Noted in the Sitka Sentinel on May 11, 1951, 30 members were present to sign the Articles of Incorporation for the Sitka Women's Club. This was a necessity in order to receive the donation of the offer by W.P. Mills Company for the Raglan building to the Sitka Women's Club. Carolyn Yaw was the president-elect, and Mr. Waldo Mills and Mrs. L.A., acting on behalf of the W.P. Corporation, gave the club the small house. In return, the Sitka Women's Club pledged perpetual care of the grave sites of William Ritchie and Mary C. Mills in the local cemetery, and subsequently all the Mills family. The Women's Club received the building for $1. So these days, the building itself has had many tenants, from antiques to jellies and jams. Currently, it's facilitating a counseling center, and it's offered the club an opportunity to have a place to have fundraisers and to socialize. It was originally rented to 2 teachers, but as you can see from this current picture, it still maintains its side-by-side original makeup that was built for Ragnhild for her millinery on one side and her living quarters on the other. the Sitka Women's Club still carries on this tradition of being a non-political, non-sectarian membership open to all women. And we carry on even through the tough times of COVID. This, again, we're supporting the books, the library kids, the gymnastics, and then the safe shelter. And then, of course, having our holiday parties and our gatherings, keep maintaining that camaraderie. So, thank you. I'll tell you a little bit about our grant too, regarding the building. What got us started on this interest in the women's suffrage, of course, was the association with the Women's Christian Temperance Union. But knowing that this building is very old and very significant in our community, we also applied for a Historic Preservation Fund grant through the local Sitka certified local government and our the city. And so we're working to organize our archives and to establish the building as a National Register site. I forgot to show you, we do have, you know, in doing this project, we quickly are calling meeting minutes and whatnot, and so we're finding materials that date back to the 1940s and 30s. There are other meeting minutes at the local Sitka Historical Museum, but we're part of what this project and this presentation is what we've found so far in organizing those archives from 1939.
Thank you, Anne. There is one question that has popped up in the Q&A, and I'll read that out loud right now. What role, if any, did local Orthodox women's societies play in early or mid-20th century activities for the promotions of women's rights? Have any of the panelists come across information about this?
No, not the Orthodox. That's a good question. Yeah, most of the research I've done, as it just mentions the Presbyterian, yeah, I think that, yeah, I don't recall any Orthodox notations.
I also wonder that I think it's one of those things you have to really look for, because as I understand it, a lot of the towns that would have had Orthodox societies likely didn't have newspapers at this time, and there would have been a few that did. So I think there's a good chance that some of these sisterhood societies were engaged in activism related to voting rights and citizenship, but unless you are specifically seeking that, it's kind of hard to just come across such a thing because of lack of sources from that era, and for a lot of the communities that were predominantly Orthodox. I know that I just pulled up the Juneau Women's Club, which was founded in 1914, and I look at the membership of the Juneau Women's Club, and it just based on the name list, it doesn't look like there really are many women that were associated with the Orthodox Church that are part of the Juneau Women's Club. And I think that there's the definite connection with the Alaska Native Sisterhood and Alaska Native Brotherhood Temperance Organization, but that's a good question and one worth researching. Are there other questions or comments or discussions that please feel free to raise your hand. Oh, look, someone has raised their hand. I don't know who raised their hand first. Karen, do you know if Rebecca or Rachel raised their hand first?
I don't know. I'm going to both of them the opportunity.
Great. Rebecca, how about you start?
There's also a question in the chat.
How about, Rebecca, would you please voice your question? You can unmute yourself or your comment.
Yes. Oh, the question in the chat.
Rebecca, are you there?
Doesn't have a microphone.
I'll address the question in the chat. It was the Kettleson Library named for Bessie, and yes, it was. Learning this information, I was kind of sad to know that they've renamed the Sitka Library to the Sitka Library instead of the Kettleson Library. So we kind of lose that little piece of history.
So Rebecca says she doesn't have a microphone. So Rebecca, do you want to type your question? And Rachel, I did just take you off, that she didn't mean to raise your hand. So Anjuli, there's Rebecca's comment in the Q&A.
Oh, Rebecca noted that she wanted to say that Anna Hanlon and possibly Nadia Bart were Russian Orthodox.
Oh, great.
Larry Smith has a question. He says, was there any connection between the Western states granting voting rights to women and the census counts in terms of federal appropriations?
This is Sue, and actually in the Western suffrage movements, I'm not sure how they impacted appropriations, because I don't know that the federal government had quite the funding to states, and the basis may not have been, they did a lot with land in the new states with land grants for universities and other purposes. And I'm not sure that they apportion grants as they do now on a per capita basis. In fact, I haven't really heard that. Others might know more than I do. But one of the rationales for letting women vote was definitely connected with the relation to the federal government and the territories. I think in all the territories it was mentioned that having more women voters would show a fuller population. And I think all of the territories kind of had to prove themselves. Just like when Alaska became a state, it wasn't clear that there were enough people to support a state. And I think the same thing was true with territories, because in my reading Bev's work, there was a lot of mention about having more voters. And some of it was on kind of racial lines. They wanted to be sure that Chinese men or Black men wouldn't get to vote if white women couldn't. So particularly in Colorado, Dr. Beeton represents that. So there was some concern about their relation to the federal government, but I'm not sure that it was grants per se, especially in those early years. I think it was more getting the territory established as a state. In Utah, there was a very peculiar kind of circumstance in which the federal government actually more than encouraged the vote among Utah women when it became a territory, because they thought that the Utah women would vote against polygamy, and the United States government was trying to eradicate polygamy on all fronts. And so one way they thought was to give Mormon women the votes, and so people who were part of a multiple wife marriage might be fed up and vote against polygamy at the polls. But that didn't happen. So the vote was actually taken away from Utah women after a period of time. And then it wasn't reinstated again until statehood. So there was a time when they had it and then they didn't have it. And it didn't have anything to do with grants. It had to do with this political religious issue.
Cady, you are in the panel room and your hand is raised.
Hey, Anjuli, how are you?
Hello.
Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Hey, I actually have a question for you. I wanted to say that I really appreciated your introduction about Bev, and I'm, now that you have had the opportunity to work with her, can you speak to her historical boyfriends, and specifically how she was so wonderful at really developing empathy and a connection to the people she was researching, and really giving a sense of humanity and humor to the past in a way that only Bev could do. So I wonder if you could speak a little about Bev's boyfriends.
That's all true. I don't know any of her specific boyfriends. I know some of her girlfriends, Cornelia Hatcher for sure, probably her favorite character in Alaska history, Lena Morrow Lewis, Nellie Cashman, these ladies that Beverly is the one that rescued these women from obscurity, really. And I know that Barb is a panelist, and so Barb, could you maybe speak to some of Bev's historical boyfriends? She really did forge a personal connection with these historical folks and depicted them with empathy and detail. And I mean, it's hard to think of sessions that I've attended that have been more entertaining than Beverly speaking about Alaska history, Barb?
Well, I know one, and I think I've got the name right. He was the fellow who championed the 2013 vote. What's his name? Somebody will know more than me. Was it? I think it was Arthur Shoup, or not Shoup.
Oh, the Sitka, or
Yeah, it was
Strong?
Shoup.
Was
No,
it?
It was Shoup.
Yeah, well, the fellow who championed it, I remember when she spoke in 2013 for the 100th anniversary for the Bar Association, she swooned over this guy from the dais. It was just great, and how much she just loved him. And I think he was just a really, he was the one she zeroed in on and really personified for everybody. So he's the only one I remember specifically, but I know there were many.
Similarly, she really despised Ingersoll, the Ketchikan representative, who was the one person to vote against the suffrage bill.
Right. Oh, scorn. Yeah.
Yes.
Good question, though. I know there are
Cady,
probably many.
Do you know some of her other boyfriends?
I can't remember specifically, but I attended the presentation she gave in Anchorage in November last year, and she had a list of her boyfriends, and I think it was her way of going into the research room and really connecting with the people of the past, and really recognizing that they were flawed human beings, but she found ways to connect, and she did that through making those connections with the audience, and I think that's kind of a hard thing to do. So I really admired her and her humor and her compassion and empathy for history. So anyway, I really appreciate you guys taking the time to recognize that.
Thank you, Cady.
Anjuli, there is a comment response from Rebecca in the Q&A before you move on to Ron would be the next person with a question.
Rebecca says that maybe the women's club served a different kind of forum than the Christian denomination women's groups. And I think this is likely the case. I mean, looking at just the agendas and meeting minutes, it was more kind of civic education and education in general, less than religious work. Wouldn't you say, Anne?
Yeah, I think that the Christian aspect was an excuse to be able to form in those days.
Yes, definitely, with the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Ron, you have joined us in the panelist section.
Yes, thank you. I was curious if the formation of the Juneau Women's Club followed after the folks sort of moved from Sitka to Juneau? Was this a transitional period, or were they in existence before?
I believe
Seems as though
so.
you've got a bunch of high-powered women there, and probably they would have been wherever the government was to have these kinds of ideas about bringing culture and knowledge and carrying that forward.
Well, I can say, so I currently, actually, maybe, I don't know if, no, I won't share my screen. I currently have pulled up a scan from the Alaska State Library's Snow collection, which includes the Juneau Women's Club yearbooks and meeting minutes starting in 1915. And I believe it was actually 1915 that the Juneau Women's Club got their start. And you look at the list of membership, and it does include people, for example, Mrs. Strong, the wife of the governor, was a member. Lena Morrow Lewis was a member and head of the economics department. There's a Miss L.M. Brady. I don't know if that would be the daughter or relation to the former Governor Brady, but without a doubt, the ladies who were involved in this original women's club were the kind of, had political connections and seemed to have economic might as well.
I know when I talked to a number of people from rural small villages, there was oftentimes a mother's club. And I don't know if that was a parallel thing or if it was more to educate people about taking care of children in smaller communities, primarily villages. Has anyone done any work on that area?
There was a home economics department of the Sitka Women's Club, but it's also interesting, you know, when Sitka was the territorial capital and it was the, you know, all the governor's wives that were part of the club, and then it seemed when it moved to Juneau around that time that, you know, it kind of carried on with the governor's wives and the forming of the women's club over there.
Ron, certainly the Mothers Club up in Utqiagvik in Barrow, that was started in connection to the Presbyterian Church mission up there. And it was, you know, based on, quote, you know, civilizing the native people and teaching them hygiene and Western dress and Western values of childcare and things like that. And so in that case, it was associated with the church, and you know, I think they did Sunday schools and things like that. I don't know about other communities.
When I interviewed Tikasuk Brown from Unalakleet, she was very, very active. She was a nurse by training, and so she knew about a number of the mothers clubs. And I don't know if this was part of that same complex, but lots of communities seem to have them. And I don't know if it is outreach for a particular religion or if it was more home ec oriented. But it's an interesting phenomenon, and I think someone should probably take a look at that.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt if it had its origins also with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, honestly. I mean, that was it was like this cult of white motherhood, essentially. It was the way that white women were able to engage in any sort of political or social activism, and they did so under the mantle of, you know, expanding white civilization. And that included in Alaska, looking at what happened at the different missions and boarding schools and all of that. A lot of these ladies, if they weren't actually members of the WCTU, their philosophy and their practice was rooted in WCTU activities.
Thank you.
I'd like to chime in here, not about the Mothers Club, but about clubs in general, because the early suffragists were not particularly club members. They were, it seemed like the early suffragists in the United States they were conference goers and convention goers, and they were women who were of the upper middle class primarily, but not exclusively, who had the time and the wherewithal. Probably there were a lot of women who were not married. There were the few college graduates, the few women that were able to graduate from college were leaders. Oberlin College, Quaker meetings were strong spawning grounds for the early suffragists. But as I saw develop in the late 18th century, the whole phenomena of clubs is very much kind of what Anjuli was talking about. It was an outlet. It was at a time when women didn't have all day back-breaking work in the home that tied them to the home or the farm. People were living more in cities and small towns than out in isolated farms, so they could get together more easily. And that was a locus for a lot of civic activity of all kinds. In the history of public libraries, a lot of public libraries all over the United States in tiny, tiny towns were started by women's groups who started reading rooms and then had ambitions for a full-fledged public library. So as you said, Anjuli, the civic energies and in some cases the political energies were also channeled through these clubs, and just the good time social activities when women finally could socialize like that out of the home. But with the Women Christian Temperance Union, the temperance movement was really strong, and it was really taken up by the Women's Christian Temperance group. But in the early 1800s, it was still a theme because there was a lot of plentiful spirits in the New World, and the idea of helping women be free of drunken husbands or husbands who drank away all the family's resources was a huge theme in the literature of that early period, and some of these women suffragists were connected with that even before the Women's Christian Temperance, and there were men involved with that movement too. So I think your take on the WCTU is right, Anjuli, but the temperance movement itself was a big kind of populist movement that really was trying to do something important for people's lives, and that was a social issue at that time that was solved through the activists and then the women's clubs later on. So that's another aspect of it.
And the 18th Amendment, Prohibition Amendment, passed before
Yes,
19th Amendment.
That's right.
Chronologically, or the number tells us so.
It shows a priority. Yeah.
Bruce, I see you've joined us over here.
Yeah, I've been this has been a great session, I must say. I have to compliment everybody, and I particularly enjoyed all the slides and PowerPoint on the Sitka Women's Club. I have to say that, and what Sue has presented. But anyway, I don't have that much to say. I think that this has been a wonderful tribute. I'm glad that Bev's memory has been honored at our conference, and I know she was working on her book, and I worked with her along with a couple of other people. We were reviewing the manuscript, and I've been asked by half a dozen or more people, like, will this thing ever be published, or what's going to happen to it? And I really don't have any news. I hope something will happen, but I just don't know. I just don't have anything this early in the game. I think we just have to wait and see what happens, and with the family and so on. But I've read the entire manuscript, and it's wonderful, especially the parts that deal with Alaska women's suffrage, and then before that, the obstacles that were encountered in Congress, in the federal Congress, about suffrage and getting that going in Alaska. So we'll just have to stay tuned and see what happens, but we'll see. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. I see Tom has joined us on this side too. Tom, you are muted if you're trying to speak.
Muted here. Yeah, this is Tom Bunsen. I just, the shoot bill was the second acted on by the new Territorial legislature that was really co-authored by Ernest Bilba Collins. He was the Speaker of the House, the Territorial House. He later became a mayor of Fairbanks, I think 5 different times. And he finally was a delegate to the Alaska Constitutional Convention. His wife was the first woman big game guide, so you can understand the kind of women that he's surrounded with. Explain a little bit about that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I see there's a couple other hands that are raised.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat or a comment in the chat that only the panelists are seeing. When people are writing chats, if you can, send it to all panelists and attendees so then everybody can see it. So Anjuli, maybe you can read
Oh,
that.
I see. Okay. Sarah Barton lets us know that the executor of Beverly Beeton's estate plans to get the book published, but has to get through attorneys and intellectual rights issues first. So that's great to hear, as we know that that's an important contribution to our understanding of progressive era, and includes really wonderful biographies about the people that we're talking about. Cady, you're back.
Just to unmute.
Oh, no, not really. I don't know why I'm all of a sudden talking. So you caught me a little unprepared here. So sorry. I just got a message that said unmute and I clicked it. So yeah, disregard. Sorry about that.
No, it's the way the raised hands are showing and me figuring out what it all means. So, okay. And Rebecca too, maybe you didn't have another question.
This is Sue, and I would like to say one more thing to an audience of historians. I think another field besides the good work of looking at the activities of the women's clubs is I took a quick look at the Library of Congress newspaper Navigator, and I looked for suffrage articles in Alaska, early newspapers, and I was very interested to see the kind of news that people in Alaska were getting about the suffrage movement elsewhere. Not so much was reported on the Alaska suffragists. Perhaps they didn't identify, but the outsiders were really heavily represented, and they were identified as suffragists, as an identifier. So it was fairly easy to search them without even looking for specific names. But it was pretty interesting. There were articles in, I think, the Skagway paper about a woman who became the first deputy sheriff in the United States, and she was a suffragist. So they were getting a pretty constant stream of news about the suffrage movement and leading suffragists, and some about the anti-suffragists too. But I thought that would be an interesting endeavor for somebody who had the time and interest in pursuing that.
Yes, I mean, that's one of the reasons that suffrage passed so quickly in Alaska, is because it was talk of the nation in addition to being talk of the territory. And that's thanks to the generations of women and men who worked to advance the conversation prior to 1913.
Right, and because there was a plethora of newspapers, there were some areas, of course, in Alaska that had no newspapers at all, but you know, when you look at the historical collections of newspapers, there were lots of them, and they were covering maybe more national news than some of our current still existing Alaska papers. It was quite interesting to me, thanks to the miracle of the telegraph instead of the internet. But it was the news. The San Francisco Examiner reported on the Alaska bill the day after it passed, and I think for those days that was pretty instant news. So
it's true, and that's a point that Beverly would often make, is that there were telegraph stations across Alaska, and so people were informed and active, reading newspapers, reading magazines. Barb.
I just wanted to say, I came in late and I'm so sorry if you already talked about it, but I think one thing Beverly did, certainly for me and many others, is really got people excited about the issues of suffrage or whatever issues she was talking about. But for me, I don't know if you mentioned Knik, Anjuli, and maybe the effort there. Just a couple stories. This summer, Beverly was the one who advised me, I don't know if anybody else, if this was common knowledge or not, but that the first woman to vote voted in Nolan Creek up by Wiseman in 1912 illegally, but did it anyway. And so, you know, my husband and I tried to get up there this summer and got eaten by the road, but we got as close as we could to Nolan Creek. And I'm thinking, who would get me to do something like that besides Beverly and her enthusiasm? It was just, you know, I wanted to go find it for her. And then, of course, later, after she passed away, went over to Knik, which was where she had documented one of the early petitions going into Juneau that led to the act being adopted. So I just wanted to raise a toast to her at this moment and thank you all for commemorating her spirit, and may we carry on her work. And here's my cup. Thanks.
Hear, hear.
Cheers.
Yes, cheers to Beverly.
It
Thank
should be filled with something other than tea or coffee, I believe.
Right.
Later.
It will be when we get together in person.
Right, for that time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Well, we've reached the end of the session. Are there any final comments, questions?
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, attendees. And like Barb said and others have said, let's keep up the good work of Beverly and also keep up the joy of the work that we do and the joy of discovery and history, because Beverly sure embodied that joy.
And just to tell everybody that 2 o'clock is our next session, and it's Topics in Alaska History. Well, we have 4 wonderful presenters, and we hope to see everybody there. And Rebecca says, progressive women, exclamation point.
Yes.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.